We are back with Anton Kaminsky. Anton, you're in the newspaper, in the Inquirer. There's an article about funeral home negligence and your case. First of all, cemetery negligence, funeral home negligence. What is this? And tell us a little bit about it.
Good morning.
Good to see you as well.
Good to see you. So somber topic, but it's really interesting. So funeral home negligence and cemetery negligence is when a loved one, passes away, unfortunately, and, you want to take care of their body. You want their last wishes and their last kind of goodbye to be this memorable thing that, it's a sad situation. You want to get closure. You want to be, put them in the ground and say your prayers, whatever it is for your religion, your, traditions. And funeral home cemetery negligence is when there's some sort of interference with that, right? Something wasn't done the way that it should have been. Either the funeral home failed to do something that they should have done or did something that they shouldn't have done, some sort of a mix-up. Same thing with the cemetery. I mean, cemetery negligence is when something about the way that you're buried or something with the ability to be buried is just not the way that it should be. And unfortunately, it happens more often than people know or people realize.
So first we want to differentiate. There's two, when you're dealing with a loved one that has passed away and going through this, there are two opportunity, I don't want to call them opportunity areas, but areas where this can happen. There's what happens with the funeral home, right? And that's pretty much everything from when they pass away to all of the processes leading up to when they're being buried. And then the cemetery is separate, and that's responsible for the burial. And so if something happens or you suspect something happens, and this is important because we were talking about this before the recording, if you suspect something might have happened, right, which might be because the funeral home didn't communicate something, the cemetery didn't communicate something, well, you notice that there might be an issue. That might be enough that there is an issue, right? We want to differentiate between those two, the cemetery and the funeral home.
Yeah, and so let's talk about them separately. Funeral home negligence, you said it perfectly, right? From the moment that someone passes until the moment that they're essentially buried or their remains are given back to you, because some people are cremated, it's really in the hands of the funeral home, usually. So they pick up the body from wherever the person passed away. A lot of times they will dress the body and embalm the body for a viewing or a service. Sometimes it's an open casket service. Sometimes it's a closed casket service. And then they will, be responsible for ensuring that the person gets to the cemetery. And there's actually a rule in Pennsylvania that a funeral director or somebody from the funeral office needs to be present at the cemetery for the burial. So if something improper or wrong or negligent happens along the way, we call that funeral home negligence.
And so right there, if someone wasn't representing the funeral home and they're along the process and you notice that, that's already a trigger warning, right? For, hey, something might not be going right.
Yeah. And so when you have these kinds of situations, what you typically have is with the funeral home negligence. So a funeral home, one of their main kind of functions is to ensure the kind of orderly burial process, right? And so they want to make sure they know who the next of kin are, right? Mm-hmm. Who needs to be notified, who needs to sign off on permission to do something, right? So for instance, one of the calls we get most often is it'll be like a brother and a sister, for example, right? And God forbid, parent passes away, brother and sister aren't speaking or aren't on great terms. And so the brother decides that he wants the mom cremated and the sister doesn't want the mom cremated. So the brother runs to the funeral home, gives them information saying that
the last wishes were to be cremated or whatever, right?
Yeah. The last, or I'm authorizing you to cremate mom or the parent, whoever. And then, sister only finds out after the remains are cremated. Wow. Right. And now it's like, well, I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. I didn't get a chance to go to the service. I mean, that's a horrific example.
Sure.
But it's things like that are happening. And then you wind up with the question of, well, whose job was it to notify the sister? And is it enough for the funeral home to just rely on the brother saying this? Do they have any research that they have to do or any inquiry that they have to perform before just, cremating somebody, right?
And do they? Does it depend?
It depends. So the laws are different, and I don't want to go into specific laws because specific situations are different. But generally speaking, in Pennsylvania, they have to get permission from the next of kin. Now, the question is, do they need permission from all of the next of kin, or do they need permission from a majority of the next of kin? And which situations does it make a difference? That's all very case specific. So I don't want to necessarily go into that.
And maybe these are specified in wills and things like that as well, right? Okay.
Exactly. There's a lot to it. And then there's also the question of, well, how should the funeral home have known, right? So maybe if you had this relationship with the funeral home where they just, did dad's burial 3 years ago and they knew that there was a brother and a sister in their own documents, right, in their own records, and then, 3 years goes by and they do mom's services, and if they had just looked in their file, they would have seen that there was a sister.
There would have been somebody else to
but they
ask,
didn't.
Right?
And now, well, is that negligence?
Right. And so I think that's helpful for people to hear, because it's not clear black and white, which a lot of cases in general in the law aren't necessarily. And so when it isn't, it's important to contact an attorney, right? I mean, that's why you do this, right?
Right. Yeah. And look, we tell people all the time, things are very fact specific, right? So I try not to go onto these shows and try not to, say, well, if this happened to you, this is what you have to do.
Right.
And you got to be careful about that, because every situation is different. There's different records, there's different documents, there's different, they should have known this, they shouldn't have known that. Is it negligent if they shouldn't have known? Maybe not, right? And so that's a big part of it. Another thing that we see in funeral homes very often is just some sort of confusion, and this is, in my opinion, one of the scariest or worst things that we see with funeral home negligence is confusion about, is this my loved one?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and it's very unfortunate. We get those calls, unfortunately, way too frequently. And what winds up happening is these businesses are usually relatively high volume businesses. So a funeral home might have, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 bodies in it at one time that they're doing services for, right? And if they mix up somebody's body with someone else's, at what stage can you catch that? And can you catch that? And what certainty do you have that they didn't do that, right? And a lot of people do open casket funerals, services, funerals. So you go in, you see the person in the casket, they close the casket.
Respects and
That's the casket that they put into the hearse. That hearse drives to the cemetery. That gets buried. Not a lot of confusion there, typically. Right. But, some religions, some traditions, they don't do open casket burials, right? And so you have this casket that nobody's really looked into, right? That gets taken to the cemetery. Nobody's ever opened it, and that gets buried. In other situations, you have remains, and again, nobody looked at those remains, and now they get cremated. Right. And when you cremate remains, there's a whole separate process. They put certain cards with the names and tags in the urn. They put a tag on the front of the box. What happens if that tag's not there, right? What are these cremated remains of?
Well, that's where I want to pause you for a second and ask. So, in an open casket situation, I imagine you probably even run into those situations where you look and you're like, I don't think this is the person, right? But in the closed casket situation, in the idea that we're not going to be able to see this person again, what is the indication, is it just a gut feeling? Like, what is the indication that, hey, the funeral home may have mixed up a body, may have committed negligence, right? It's obvious if you said, hey, we're doing a burial, and you get an urn back, right? There was a mistake there. But how do you know if you don't know?
Well, so that's a great example, and that's a great question. The case that actually is in the Inquirer today is... what the family was told is that their loved one was autopsied. And they said, the funeral home told them that somebody performed an autopsy on their loved one. And they're like, well, there was no reason to perform an autopsy on my loved one.
Whoa.
And they're, based on that, they were essentially told not to do an open casket burial. So they didn't see the person because they were told he was autopsied. And then when they called the medical examiner's office to try to figure out why this person was autopsied, they're like, he wasn't autopsied. And so now the funeral home told them that he was autopsied, and the medical examiner's office and the death certificate says that he was not autopsied. And so now you get this confusion in your head of like, well, why would you tell me my loved one was autopsied if he wasn't? Wow. Could it be that it's somebody else in there?
Right. So is it somebody else? Did the medical examiner make a mistake? Did the funeral home make a mistake? Right. Because most likely, I get to your point, if the medical examiner is saying we never did this, the funeral home says it happened, are they looking at the wrong body?
Yeah. And I actually didn't know this, but on the death certificate, it will say whether or not somebody was autopsied. And so you get a relatively conclusive piece of paper that says there was no autopsy done.
Wow.
And especially, why do they do autopsies typically? I mean, typically they do autopsies when they don't know the cause of death.
Sure.
Right. Or if there's some, they suspect some sort of foul play and they want to figure out what happened. Right. But if you know why the person died or they died in a hospital,
you're not doing an autopsy.
You're typically not doing an autopsy.
Wow.
So if somebody's telling you that these remains were autopsied, what?
And so I imagine that there's such an emotional toll that now forever, this is top of mind concern. Every time you think of your loved one, you're wondering, did I bury the right person? Is that when I'm visiting, right, the graveside? Who am I visiting?
Yeah,
right?
Of course. And so the story I tell is, I don't know if you've ever read the book. There's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
It sounds like something I need to read.
You should. It's a great book. And I'm not sure if it's in the book or not, because the story kind of is blended with something else. But he did a TED Talk, and he did a TED Talk about it. He talks a lot about your thought processes and the way your memory works and the way that your decision-making processes work. And the story that he tells that I think is a very good story for this exact type of situation is, let's say you and your family, you go to Disney World, right? And you have the time of your life in Disney World, right? You spend a week there, you go on all the rides, you get all the pictures with all the Disney characters, you had a great experience with your kids, your family. And then on the way home, your flight gets redirected from Florida. It's supposed to come to Philadelphia, but it doesn't. It goes to Texas, right? You spend an overnight at a Texas airport sleeping on the floor. Your family's hungry and miserable. And, it takes you 48 hours to get home when it should have taken 3 hours, right?
I feel like we've all been through that nightmare at least once.
Yeah, at least once. Well, what do you remember about that Disney trip?
You remember Texas.
You remember Texas. You remember that horrible flight, right? And so, unfortunately, it's a similar kind of situation. People have a memory of their loved one, whatever it is, your dad, your mom, your grandparents, your brothers, your sisters, your kids, God forbid. But you have these memories, and these are these positive memories. And then something right at the end of this process gets interjected in such a negative and uncertain way. And that does tremendous emotional damage to people.
Right. You're already dealing with a traumatic situation that you're trying to find closure in. And that's the whole point of, I would say most people would agree that this is a process of closure, right? And if there's negligence like this that creates an open-ended question forever, you're not getting that closure, right? And it now becomes the memory for that experience.
Yeah, and unfortunately, some of these things can be fixed, right? You can try to get an answer, but there's some situations that can't be fixed. And there's let's say you mix up the remains of someone, right? But they're ashes, right? You can't perform DNA tests on ashes, and you can't, on cremated remains, there's no DNA test. So if the ashes that you receive don't have a name tag on them, you're going to say, well, how do you know that this is my loved one? How do you know? Right. And let me see your records. And then your records are sloppy.
Even in the case that you described that's in the Inquirer, I imagine that the burden of digging this person up, the remains, to go and validate that it's the right person, that there wasn't an autopsy, was an autopsy, that is a traumatic experience in of itself. I imagine there's costs associated with it. And, we say rest in peace for a reason, right? So it sounds like what we're getting to is damages, right? And you've got first proving what's the burden of proof that something went wrong, right? That the funeral home or the cemetery did something wrong. And then from there, especially when it's unprovable, right? Like we really don't know what happened. What are the opportunities for damages?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, and we got to separate it a little bit, right? So proving what they did wrong or whether or not they did something wrong is sometimes, easy. Sometimes the liability is clear. Sometimes they admit they made a mistake, right?
Wow.
Hey, we made a mistake. We're sorry, right? So the liability is usually not that hard, right?
Okay.
If people feel uncertain, there's already something that went wrong.
Probably went wrong.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be, you were actually negligent, but something that you did in the process gave them this uncertainty. And you said a little bit earlier that, you have this grieving process, you have this closure process, and part of, you said rest in peace, right? It's your final resting place, right? And so to say to somebody, hey, we're going to need to dig this person up that we just got buried a week ago or a month ago or whatever it is, or 6 months ago or sometimes years ago, right? To figure out if this is the right person. That in and of itself causes harm.
Yeah.
Right. And so people, cemeteries, funeral homes, when you talk to them about these cases, they take that as a given, right? They almost say, oh, well, no problem. We'll dig them up and we'll figure it out, right? Well, wait a second. What do you mean you're going to dig them up, right? It's like this person's been buried and it's, either delays the burial or you try to figure it out right then and there, or the person had just gotten buried. That's one thing. I mean, that's still horrible, but it's one thing where it's because it's just right now.
Sure.
But if somebody's been buried for 10 years and it's like, oh, by the way,
these wounds. And,
you're bringing this whole situation screaming back, and I got to relive this whole thing again. I think, that's a whole different damage.
I do want to mention this really quick because there's two things that you said that I want to make sure people listening or watching this take away is first is the feeling, right? Because you're dealing with a grieving process, you're probably going through a lot of emotional things and you're probably going to talk yourself out of it. Like, no, I'm just being crazy. That couldn't have happened, right? It can happen. And if you have that feeling that there might've been cemetery or funeral negligence, that alone, the fact that something might've happened to trigger that is probably enough that you should talk to an attorney in many cases. And then the second piece of it is that on the damages side is that, well, what am I going to do? What are we going to do? We're going to go, it's been 10 years. It's been 6 months. It's been 1 month. I'm not opening up. We're not going to go back and dig them up. Like, just to prove this, like, I don't want to deal with that. There's no opportunity for me. That's not true either, right? There is an opportunity to get justice. There is an opportunity to make, for damages to make something right in this situation. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think those are two areas that might dissuade people from even calling.
Yeah. And actually that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this today is, we see very often people saying, oh, I wasn't going to call, or, the medical examiner's office told me to call a lawyer. Right. I wasn't going to call a lawyer. Or this person said, they'll take care of it. Don't worry about it, right? Or I didn't want to, one thing I heard from a family one time is, well, we did this, very private burial, right? And now they're telling us that that's not my loved one in there. I don't want to have to call my entire family and tell them that this is what's happening.
Right. People might have traveled in. People, right. They don't want to even.
Well, yeah. And it's like, I'm living it, but I don't want to put this burden on other people to live, well, we don't know if that's who they say it is. Right. And so that in and of itself, it prevents people from reaching out. Right. And I tell people all the time, the same way that you should talk to a lawyer, you really should talk to somebody like grief counseling, psychiatrists, therapists, whatever it is, because you need that, right? You need that outlet. A lot of time people as they're grieving, they take this on too, and they don't wind up properly grieving, and they're almost living in limbo. And unfortunately, we do the lawsuits, and I see it firsthand, right? Some of these lawsuits drag out for a year or 2 years, and that in and of itself, fails to provide closure, right? And so really one of the things that we try to do as a service to people as lawyers, other than, hey, we got to fix this, we got to recover some sort of damages for it, is to help them get to that closure, right? And sometimes, you said this earlier, and I wanted to go back to it, is sometimes you can dig somebody up, as horrific as that is, and say, okay, see, that is that person, right? But what if you dig them up and it's not that person?
Right.
Right. And so that uncertainty in and of itself might be never closed, right? And then the other piece of it is, well, why should I have to dig them up to get this certainty? Right. Shouldn't your books and records as a funeral home or as a cemetery be good enough that you could point to this and say, I am 100% certain.
Right.
And that there's nobody else that it could be.
Right. The fact that even up front, it wasn't clear enough that created this whole situation. That is the problem. That is negligence in and of itself, right?
Right. And I think that's a good transition to go into the cemetery piece of it.
Sure.
Because the cemetery piece of it is a little bit more document and in history, and there's more negligence there that might have happened before you got there, right? Because a funeral home, right, they're just supposed to take care of this body, these remains. They're really only responsible to you for this limited window when they have your loved one's remains in their possession, right? Whereas a cemetery, a lot of these cemeteries, what they push is pre-need. Come buy your graves in advance, right? Make sure that there's space for your loved ones, right? Parents die, right?
You buy two plots,
buy two plots, right? And, hopefully, God willing, your other parent lives for 30, 40, 50 more years, right? And you don't need to use that plot for a long time. So the cemetery has a duty that technically spans from the moment that they sold you that first grave until the second grave can be used.
Right.
And a lot of times in these, especially these smaller, mom and pop shop cemeteries, the records aren't that great.
Sure.
And when they're getting passed down from generation to generation or from owner to owner, those records get lost in translation, or they get, messed up, or there's errors in them. And we've seen, for cemetery negligence, the thing that I see the most is bad record keeping.
Okay.
And you have bad record keeping, and that results in all sorts of crazy things. And more often than not, you learn about this crazy thing on the day of the burial, right? We should be burying our loved one today.
Wow.
And you're telling me today there's a problem?
Right. And that problem is, it's been 30 years since my mom passed away. She's in plot 1. We're supposed to be pulling up. I've been visiting her every year. We're now supposed to pull up to plot 2 to bury my dad. And the plot's full, right? And so, and you're finding that out on the day of,
right? Yeah.
Oh
Well, that's one example, right? They sold 2 graves. Mom was buried in there, in 1997, right? Dad, God willing, lives to 2024, right?
Right.
And that's 30 years. And in those 30 years, you show up and you say, hey, they tell you on the day that they're digging the grave, we found another casket here. Right. And so we can't bury Dad today. And it's like, well, whose casket is it? We're not sure. We're getting to the bottom of it.
Wow.
Right. And don't forget, there's a flip side of this now, right? Because now somebody's getting a phone call where their loved one's been buried for 10 years. And they're like, hey, we buried your loved one in the wrong spot. We have to dig him up or her up.
Okay. So in that situation, now you have, it's such a it's such a cluster, but you've got the family that thought that they were going to be burying mom next to dad. There's somebody already there. That family now needs to be informed. Hey, and that's the obligation of the, is that by law, or is that just the circumstance of the funeral home? Like, do they have to move that body because you paid for that spot? And, not to make a joke here, right? Real estate, location, it matters. Are they obligated to move that body, or are you obligated? Like, does it depend? How does that work at that point?
It definitely depends, right? But the general gist, and again, every situation's different, every contract's different, every, cemetery agreement's different. But the general rule of thumb, I would say, is that, especially if you've prepaid for that plot, you have the right to be buried in that plot.
Okay.
And so if someone else is buried in that plot, they made an error and they have to figure out how to get that person out.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
But you have to understand that might not happen overnight. Right.
Of course.
Let's say you go to the family, you can't find the family. Or let's say you go to the family and they just say no. Right. Now, what are you doing?
Oh my
right.
gosh.
They say no. Now you have to go against their expressed wishes and do what? You go to the court and ask the court to give you an order to remove that person? Or do you have to now dig mom up to move her in a different place just so mom and dad could be buried together?
When we were talking about this and recording this episode, my initial understanding was like, hey, if you think you've experienced funeral home or cemetery negligence, right, this is really an episode for you to listen to. I'm now hearing this and going like, if you own a funeral home or you run a cemetery, you better have your records right. You really have to get those things right, because the cost, the burden, the emotional toll, it is a big responsibility, right? It's a huge responsibility. These are businesses. We understand that. People are people make mistakes, but it is a really big responsibility to do this. And I think that it's important and it's helpful that you're doing this, right? That you are holding these organizations responsible for that responsibility they chose to take on.
We certainly try to. And I've seen some horrific things, man. I've seen, you go to a cemetery and they have whiteout on their maps, right? Like, why would there be whiteout on your map, right? Like, what does that mean? That means you had somebody there and then you moved them, or you thought somebody was there and now you don't think that person's there anymore, right?
Because you're not like selling areas of the funeral of your cemetery for right. Like it's
like why is there whiteout on your records, right?
Wow.
And so I think this is an episode that's an important episode, not only for certainly to not scare maybe, but to put
Help people understand. Yeah. Help
Put
cemetery, and funeral
cemetery,
home know.
on notice. Like, hey guys, you keep good records, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have a ton of cases, and I don't want to go into specific details of it, but there's times where one hand at the cemetery just doesn't know what the other hand's doing, right? There'll be like a document that says, don't do this, right? Don't do X, whatever X might be. Don't do it. Don't bury somebody in this grave. This is mom's grave. Don't bury a brother or sister or whoever into this particular grave. And there's a document and a record in the cemetery that somebody wrote, notarized.
To say don't do that.
To say don't do that. And the cemetery went, okay, we got it. They wrote a letter back and said, we won't. And then, 10 years goes by and somebody says, use that grave. And they're like, okay. And then they use the grave,
Oh my gosh.
right? And they use the grave and they have no authority to do that. And when you call and you go, why did you guys do that? And there's a letter. They're like, oh, well, that was in our paper files, not in our digital files.
Right.
It's like, so did you just not check your other files? Oh, well, it was misfiled. Oh, okay. Well, how often do you check to see if things are misfiled in your cemetery?
Right. That sounds a little bit like negligence.
Right.
Which is where I want to hit something really quick, Anton, before we move on, because I think that, we've hit a couple different examples. You've shared some anecdotes, but I just want to list out really quick, if that's okay, cemetery negligence and funeral home negligence. I have a list here, and I just want folks that are listening to this or watching this right now to understand these are the most common complaints and concerns. So cemetery negligence first. The inability to bury on a scheduled date, right? So if they miss the date, they're supposed to schedule on, this Sunday we're bringing all our relatives together. The cemetery, for whatever reason, says, sorry, we can't bury that date.
So yes, sometimes that's negligent, sometimes not. Sometimes the weather is horrible, right? And you're like, hey, we can't dig today. Or we try to open up the grave and there's a river running through it, right? Like, so sometimes that's not negligent. Sometimes that's realistic.
Okay.
It's only negligence if you can't bury that day because there's something wrong with the grave.
Got it.
Right?
Okay.
Like something wrong with the
that
grave
inherently
that shouldn't
was in their responsibility. If there's groundwater, we don't know that until we dig, right? But there are a lot of other reasons. So inability to bury on a scheduled date, grave space not available. I think we just talked about that, right?
Yep.
It's just burial at an incorrect depth.
Yeah, so that's another thing. It's a whole different area, but there's this idea of double depth burials, and not a lot of people know that that's even a thing. But what they do is to conserve space and to conserve money, usually because you're only buying one grave plot instead of two. They'll do a double depth burial, and so they'll bury the first person that dies lower in the grave than 6 feet. Right? We all remember 6 feet under. Right? They bury the first body at 8 feet, first burial container, not body. But the first burial container goes at about 8 to 9 feet, so that it's about 3 feet tall, 2.5, 3 feet tall, so that the next container can go at 6 feet. Yeah, and then you're fine, right? But sometimes what they wind up doing is they mess that up, right? They bury the first double depth body or double depth container at 6 or 7 or whatever, and now you got like a hill in the cemetery because the person's not being able to be buried right. And there's laws about that, right?
Okay.
There's a pretty clear law. I forget what the exact inches is, but it's like there's got to be 12 to 18 inches, I believe, of soil on top of the burial container.
Okay.
Right.
Well, not to be silly with this, but like, am I supposed to bring a yardstick to the
No,
the
but
funeral?
you can tell if you're sitting at a burial and they've lowered the casket all the way or the burial container all the way down into the ground and it's flush with the ground, there's not going to be 18 inches on top of it.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so that's something that you might, again, I think this is one of the things where if that happens, you're talking yourself out of it. You're going like, I'm being ridiculous, right? I'm grieving. It's got to be me. There's no way they could do that. They could absolutely do that. Improper embalming. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we've run into that once or twice where somebody gets hired to this is a funeral home issue, not a cemetery issue, but the funeral home is going to embalm somebody to prepare them for a viewing. And, you come in and the person looks nothing like the person that your loved one is or was, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, what did you guys do here? And sometimes what funeral homes do is they have not the funeral director doing the embalming, and that's usually fine, right? with oversight, given that these people are
Right.
properly licensed, properly
Trained
and everything like that. But somebody, sometimes they have people that are not properly trained and licensed doing the embalming, and you get there and you're like,
So it's
what
as
is
simple
this?
as it's as simple enough to say, like, if they did a really bad job on the embalming, right, and you feel like who you're looking at just they did not, for this is a viewing, you've got all your family coming in. I don't know if you've ever been. I've been to those ceremonies before.
Sure.
It's an event, and
Right.
if you're coming up and going to pay last respects, and this person doesn't look anything like it's the person. We're not saying like they embalmed the wrong person. It's just they did not do a good job in the embalming. That could be a potential.
It
for
could be.
negligence.
It depends on who did it, and maybe they had somebody do it that shouldn't have been doing it.
Right. And I know that you'd said, and we'll get this in funeral home negligence, but that just operating without a license or mixing up remains. We'll get to
Sure.
that in a minute. But unauthorized cremation, this is a horrific idea, especially if you had an idea and vision or the person had last rites of how they wanted to be buried. And now they've been cremated and there's no going back on that.
Right. Yeah. And that happens for either, the funeral home messes up for whatever reason. They thought they had authority and they didn't, right? Or they got somebody's authority and that wasn't the person's authority that they should have gotten.
Sure.
And those cases are a lot harder because the question of who has the right to control the remains, it's kind of up in the air. Not exactly up in the air, but there's disputes about it. Is it, do you need 50%? What if you have 3 people? What if you have 2
Right.
people? What if you can't find one? What if the person's not responding to you? So those kinds of things are a little bit harder. But if you paid for the person to be embalmed and buried, and somebody says, "Here's your cremated remains," that's a problem.
That's a problem. Let's go into funeral home negligence, right? Because we differentiate between the two. So I referenced this a second ago, operating without a license and mixing up remains. I feel like the mixing up remains, we've talked about some of the ways that could happen, but operating without a license, I mean, should I be asking the funeral home to share their license with me? Is that going to be in the contracts? If I don't see that, is that a concern? Where does this come up?
So, yeah, I mean, this is a great question. We could spend an hour on that alone. There's a couple of things that I've seen happen. Number one, they'll have a funeral home salesperson, somebody that's kind of like known in the area,
Okay.
will be like, "Hey, I heard so-and-so passed away. Let me know if you need me to do funeral services." And they're essentially selling the services of another funeral home, right? They're like the middleman
Okay.
for the funeral home, right? And I've seen that. And that person, that person that sells you funeral services should be actually affiliated with the funeral home. They should be
Interesting.
licensed under the funeral home. Their name should come up under the funeral home. Very often, funeral director licenses expire.
Okay.
Funeral directors are actually, if I recall correctly, and again, don't quote me on this because I'm not trying to, ruffle any feathers, but my recollection is that a funeral director can only be associated with one funeral home at one time. So if you have one funeral director that's associated with 3 or 4 funeral homes, that's a problem.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
You got to make sure, because they have to be, if again, my recollection, this could be incorrect, but my recollection is that they should be associated with one funeral home. So you're a funeral director for one funeral home. You can't be a funeral director for 7 different funeral homes. You can own multiple funeral homes potentially, but you got to have a different funeral director at each one.
Is it, I mean, just to push back for a second, is it just a technicality? Like, hey, my continuing education credits expired. It's no big deal. I'll get them back soon. Or is there like a real, or are there other concerns beyond that?
There's other concerns, and I'm glad you asked that. Well, listen, if you're a lawyer and hey, my lawyer credentials expired, it's like,
Probably
no.
can't run my case.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But no, to be serious for a second, there's also the other thing about being licensed or not being licensed that's very important is the insurance question. And a lot of times people don't even ask this insurance question. And I unfortunately have run up against it. And this is something that you definitely want to talk to people about and you want to raise awareness for. Is I've been in situations where you go to a funeral home, right? The funeral home is negligent. They apologize for hey, we're sorry, we did something wrong. We're like, okay, well, refer this to your insurance carrier. They refer it to their insurance carrier. Guess what? They don't have coverage for the type of thing that they're doing.
Okay.
Right. So you have a funeral home whose job it is to, do funeral services and potentially cremate people, right? Because that's part of it.
The right insurance.
And well, they might have insurance for like the funeral director portion of it, but not anything that's associated with cremation. Right. And so if they make a mistake in the process
Sure.
of like who should or shouldn't be cremated, sorry, we don't have coverage for that. right? I've seen it. And so and that's a thing that people, when you go to a funeral home, I mean, you never even think to ask that question, right?
Sure.
You never think to ask, hey, can I see your license? Make sure that your license is active. Hey, can I see your insurance to make sure that you guys are properly insured for this? Some funeral homes don't have insurance at all. Full stop. And
you can operate a business without a...
So you could have general liability insurance, right? The kind of thing that's like, hey, if somebody slips and falls at your funeral home, we'll cover that. But we don't cover your funeral services.
Well, so don't you at that point just go after the funeral home? But in that case, they might not have the money to pay. And then
they might have no assets. And you might be the 18th person that's going after them.
Right.
Because, if they don't have insurance and they don't have a proper license, the chances are that
it's not their first rodeo,
right?
In a couple different ways.
And so if there's one like big takeaway from this thing, it's when you go to use a funeral director, make sure it's a reputable funeral director. Ask them what kind of insurance they have. I mean, that's a legitimate question, man. You have a contractor doing work on your home. Do you ask them if they have insurance?
Right. Well, a lot of people don't, and they fall into situations as a result of that, right?
On the next episode
of this is really just like scare tactics for businesses, and make sure you have insurance. If you don't, look at all the things you could be messing up. That is, I wanted to ask you too, because you've said a couple times, I just want to differentiate. Funeral director, right? That's a person, that's a job, that's the owner, let's say, or who runs it. And then funeral home. You've said director a few times. I just want to make sure for folks listening, like, is there a differentiation that's relevant there? Meaning like I'm a director, the funeral entity, the business, whatever is separate, or like we're one and the same. Like you said, if I'm the funeral director, I can only work at one facility. Therefore we're one and the same. Who am I looking at? Like if I'm vetting somebody, what am I thinking about in that regard?
So it is both separate and one and the same. So typically a funeral director, because there's only supposed to be associated with one funeral home, is that person for that funeral home, right? But a funeral home will also have other employees, right? Okay. So there'll be associates, there'll be like trainees, so to speak, right? And it's okay to let trainees to do work, right? They just have to be properly trained and licensed and in the system there. And so, if something happens at a funeral home, right, it might have been the trainee that did the error. So it's going to be the trainee that's probably responsible, but you're not going to sue the funeral trainee. So you're going to sue the funeral home, right? And then it's really the funeral director's job to be the CEO or the manager and to oversee and to supervise, right? Keywords, the trainee. And so then part of the claim is that you didn't properly supervise your trainee. And that's why this embalmed person looks like somebody other than who we expected to, right? Or you didn't properly supervise your trainees and they didn't keep adequate records. And now we have no idea who this person is.
Definitely good things to think about. I'm going to keep moving into this list because this one's really interesting to me. Refusing to release the remains to the family. What would be a situation where the funeral home doesn't? I mean, I imagine if you're, if you're cremated, right? That's the whole point. You're going to have those remains released. We know from talking to you that you want to make sure that all the identifiers are there, and if they're not, to be suspicious and to ask questions. But are there any other situations where a funeral home might refuse to release the remains to the family?
Yeah, so I've seen it in a couple of different instances. One instance is, they say, pay me this additional money or something like that. And, we thought it was going to be $5,000. We signed a contract for $5,000. Before I release these, I realized that we had extra expenses here and there. You got to pay another $2,000 or I'm not releasing the remains, right? That's, scammer stuff, but I've seen it. I've gotten phone calls for it. The other main instance that kind of comes to mind, and I saw an article about this. I haven't actually had a case about this, but this actually happened out west, where a funeral home was like super negligent, right? They did a lot of bad stuff, or allegedly negligent stuff, right? And they were not releasing remains to people because I don't think they were sure that those are they mixed up so many people that I don't think that they could have really released the remains back to people because they realized that if they did that, wait a second, who's
then
this?
They're proving that they've made this mistake.
And so it was like, for that reason, I think they were just, not responding.
That sounds like a relatively unique case, but I think that if you're in a situation, and this sounds like something that's more likely to happen, where you're getting taken advantage of, there's more money that you didn't agree to, right? before paying that just because you're grieving in that moment, right, and just want to get these remains back and move on, make sure you talk to an attorney, because there may be a chance that funeral home is acting negligently, and that's an interesting one to think about. I think that obviously this one's sexual perversion or necrophilia, right? I don't know if we want to really go into depth into what that might entail, but like, have you seen cases where is that something where how does that even come to pass that somebody would find out? I mean, it's a horrific thing to think about, but
I don't think we need to go into too much detail about it, but I've seen, without going, to that extreme, I've seen a case out in northern Pennsylvania, I believe, where one of the employees either at the morgue, I think it was at the morgue or at the funeral home, they were taking pictures with like dead bodies. I don't know why they would do that, but they were. And then they were showing those pictures to their friends. And it was like, well, why do you have a picture of my loved one? And you're like, so like that kind
just
of thing.
Grotesque behavior.
It's
right?
yeah, it's disrespectful.
Yeah,
and it's grotesque behavior, and it's it's just kind of like the desecration of a
loved one,
a loved one, and of their remains, right?
Yeah.
Like, why are you interacting with their remains in this way?
And so in that situation, right, it's just, God forbid anybody has to ever deal with this. But if you find out that somebody, took photos or did anything, like there's an opportunity to get justice for that as well. Improper embalming, we talked about a lot. I think we probably covered that. Mixing of cremation ashes. This is really, just to make sure I'm retaining this is really a situation where if you're getting the ashes back and there aren't the proper identifiers throughout the way, or you see anything that feels suspicious, ask questions. There could be a situation where the ashes weren't properly handled, right? And that's, if you want to maybe hit that one more time, what are those identifiers along the way that I should be looking out for?
So typically when you get remains cremated, what there is, and people don't really think about it like this, but you have an urn, right? And inside the urn, they don't just dump the ashes inside the urn. There's usually like a bag inside the urn,
okay.
right? And so what standard, I don't want to say standard practice, what I would call good practice is before you start, putting ashes in, so you take the urn, you put the bag into the urn. What I would do is I would put a card that's got, the person's name of whose ashes we're putting at the bottom of this bag,
okay.
right? And then you put the ashes into the bag, right? And then maybe one more time at the top of the bag, we put another card, little, identifier. Then you seal the bag, right? And then, you seal the urn, and usually on the urn, you'll put some sort of identifying information, whether that's like a sticker on the bottom of the urn, on the top of the urn, wherever, right? And then that urn will typically go into a box, and it'll have also a name on it, right? Because when you have to think about it like this, right? When you're a funeral home, you probably have 5, 10, 20, 2, I don't know, boxes sitting like this on your shelf waiting for somebody to pick them up, right? Somebody got cremated, you got the cremated remains back, they're sitting on your shelf until somebody picks them up. So how are you differentiating these boxes, right? They all functionally look the same probably, or at least very similar.
Right, makes sense.
Right? And so if you open one of these boxes and the name is different than the one that you're expecting to see, that's a question. If there's no identifying information at all, how do you know these are human? How do you know this is my loved one's ashes? How do you know these are human ashes? How do you know this is what is this? Right. What did you just give me? Right?
So at the point in time, if I'm not seeing a very clear, distinct labeling process, right, that is enough at that point, because obviously I'm not back there. I don't know what they're doing, right? But if I'm not seeing a clear labeling process, that is a concern. Are there any other points of notifications that you might be getting, the pickup process, anything else that are hints that like folks should go,
yeah, well,
this is a head scratcher here?
There's a couple. I had a situation where somebody, it cuts both ways, right? You go and pick up the remains, right, from the funeral home, and you got them for like a week. And then you get a phone call from the funeral home. They're like, hey, when are you guys going to pick up these remains?
Oh, okay.
Right? So like, whose remains did I pick up?
Oh my gosh.
Right? Or vice versa, right? You
it's a little
have
different.
not picked up remains, right? You go to pick up remains and they're like, you already picked them up. What are you talking about?
Right. And then at that point, it could have been, hopefully it's a family member. They released it to somebody else. Right. You just got to call your sibling.
Or you don't know, right? And
wow.
so again, and I can't stress this enough. A lot of people really in a time of grief and in a time of mourning and in a time of like, I just want closure, they're very hesitant to reach out to somebody.
Sure.
And we have systems set up. I mean, you call, you speak to our paralegals, you give us your information, tell us what happened. It's really a fact-sensitive basis, because one of the things that I actually like to do, and I spent so much time doing it, and we don't really get compensated for it, is if I could give you that closure without having to sue anybody.
Sure.
Right? Maybe you write a letter to the funeral home and there's a perfectly good explanation, right? And you don't have experience doing this because this is the one time that this has happened to you.
Right.
But I've done dozens of these.
Sure.
Right? And so if somebody tells me, oh, well, this happened, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Or they show me, a chain of custody, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's good enough for me to tell me that, yes, this was a mix-up, but this mix-up got resolved because you only had 2 sets of remains in your funeral home at the time, and this person says they have this one, and that means I have the other one. Right. And so I've had people call me and they say, hey, my son's not buried where they say he is. They told me he was over here, and now they're telling me he's over here. I go out to the cemetery with them, or I write a letter to the cemetery, and the cemetery says, here's our records are good, we're confident, this or that, right? And I go out to the cemetery with them, and we walk the graves, and I see it, and I could say, look, I know you might have been heated when they're explaining it to you. You're grieving. You're like, I don't believe you. You're the cemetery guy. But look, it's in my interest to pursue this case if there is a case, but it's also in my interest to not pursue a case if there isn't.
Not.
Yeah.
Right.
And so if I can give you that closure, if I could walk through the process with you in a way that it says, hey, look, there's really nothing here, right? That'll also help.
And we know this from you might say like, well, why couldn't the funeral home or cemetery just properly explain that? But these miscommunications happen, and a lot of times, and I'm sure folks listening and watching this know from other experiences in their life that like sometimes you just need an attorney to send a letter for people to actually start behaving properly, right? And so I think there's a lot of value in that. I'll jump through a couple more of these examples here because there are several, and I think it's really important that people understand what funeral home negligence is, right? To see if God forbid there is something that there is an issue, right? So there's 3 here I'm gonna go through quick. There's mishandling and mistreatment of the corpse or selling remains, which you're gonna have to hit in a second because we'll have to cover that before you leave, Anton. Robbing the dead body and wrong body in the coffin. So mishandling and mistreatment of the corpse, I think we've covered a couple different variations of this. But again, I always want to go back to like, how do I know? How do I know that I should call you or think about a situation? And then there's the selling of remains, which I see a link here to another place. I'll click on that later. You tell me a little bit about what's going on here, Anton.
So this was just an extreme case that we saw in the news, and I think we wrote about it at one point. So now you get a link there. There was somebody somewhere that was basically selling remains out of a morgue, and clearly that's somebody's remains that they're selling.
Oh my gosh.
Right? And so that story struck me as crazy. And one of the things that I do just, for our website is to show people how extreme some situations might be so that they don't think that their situation is so extreme that they need to just, let it go. Get some help, talk to somebody.
Yep. No, that makes total sense. And we'll put that link in here so that people can go and check that out on your website. This is an interesting one, robbing the dead body, because I think that like we've heard about these things in kind of folklore and things like that. Right. And is there an obligation on behalf of the funeral home? And then this is in the process, because remember, my head immediately went to, well, the cemetery, if someone's, robbing graves, like who's liable and all that. But we're talking about the funeral home folks. So we're talking about in the process, right? The folks that are responsible for everything from time of death to getting your loved one properly buried, right, in the cemetery. Things are being stolen.
I mean, it's relatively simple and it's straightforward. Hopefully it never happens to anyone, but a lot of times people say, I want to be buried with my insert, object here.
Sure.
Right. And, whether it's a ring, maybe it's some sort of necklace that you loved and, they
an outfit.
Right. Whatever it may be. And then, you get there on the day of the open casket and you're like, hey, where's that necklace that he's supposed to be wearing? And it's like, what necklace? Right. And it's like, I saw that also somewhere. I've never personally had a case of that, but, it's something that can happen. And so I put it out there.
Yeah. And no, it makes total sense. And that's something that, again, if you're suspicious that something like this may have happened, you should not sit on it. You're not being ridiculous. You're not just grieving. You are possibly being wronged, and there may be negligence that you should pursue. Wrong body in the coffin.
Yes.
What's going on here? I mean,
well, that's along the lines. So I know that that's under the funeral home negligence. I think that maybe the intent or the better place to put that would be under the cemetery negligence piece of it. And one of the things that I don't think we covered, but I think we should, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but is sometimes somebody's been grieving in one place of a cemetery for many, many years, right? I always come next to this tree. I'm right here. There's a bench over here. I could see the store over there across the street from right here, and I know exactly where I've been grieving this whole time, right? And, 10, 15, 20 years later, another loved one gets buried, or another loved one passes away and needs to be buried next to this person that you've been going. And they're like, well, we buried him over there next to your mom. Right. And you're like, what do you mean over there? I've been going right here this whole time. And they're like, no. They've actually been over there this whole time. Right. And you're like, well, why was there a headstone here? Right. And like, no. Well, we fixed it. We put it in the right spot.
Oh my gosh. So this was about to interrupt you and ask, like, there's usually a headstone of some sort so that.
Well, so let's talk about headstones for a second. And this actually, a lot of people don't know this, and this is another good reason to call a lawyer. And this is actually another way that I've helped solve a lot of people's problems because people just don't know this.
Yep.
So when you go into a cemetery, very often it's packed with headstones. There's a headstone to the left, headstone to the right. So, and they don't bury people with a shovel the way that you see in the movies. Usually there's a backhoe, right? And so it digs a hole, and that's that's where they bury. And so in order to get the backhoe there, very often they need to move headstones. Right. And that's, again, a completely normal process at a cemetery.
Okay.
That the headstones that are surrounding this grave
are
going to get moved. They're going to dig a hole. They're going to bury somebody here, and then they're going to put the headstones back. Perfectly normal situation. Now, I've gotten a ton of calls from people going, they move the headstone, and, I don't know what's happening. Right. And it's like, okay, well, was somebody buried there? Yeah, there's a new grave there. I'm like, okay, well, did you go back again this week and tell me if the headstone's still there? And they go back, they're like, oh, thank God, everything's fine.
I don't know. I laughed a little bit, but that's closure.
Right, that's closure. Yep. Right, and that's closure that we can give you in a 5-minute phone call.
Sure.
Right, but sometimes you go back and it's 3 months later and they haven't moved the headstones back. And it's like, well, what are you guys doing? Right? Or sometimes you go back, and let's go back to that original thing that we talked about a long time ago where you have a map with whiteout on it. Right. And did you move the headstone back to where it was before you whited it out or after you whited it out? Right. And so, like, what did you put the headstone back to? Right. And what records are you basing that on? Right.
But that also indicates that your example, because, I'm trying to think, it's funny as I'm listening to some of these anecdotes that I had never heard before, I'm going like, okay, what's the ending going to be? Right. Like, in these stories, and in that story, when you said, I've been going to this tree, I've been standing in the same spot for the last 10 years grieving, and this is where I go. You can see how if they had moved that headstone to bury somebody else and maybe whoever was doing it didn't pay attention and put it back in the wrong spot, mixed them up. Maybe there was 2 burials going on in 2 different locations. You can see how it's possible that somebody would place the headstone in the wrong place.
Or even worse, right? Let's say they do that, right? Let's say you've been going to this spot for 5 years, whatever it is, right? And they do a burial next to you, and they realize for the last 5 years that they had the headstone in the wrong place, right? And so they move it to the right place.
Yeah.
But they don't tell you. They don't call you and go, hey, we figured this out. We're so sorry. It was in the wrong place. Our bad. We moved it here. Here's all the records that'll show you that
that's correct.
That's correct. What they do is nothing often, right? And so you show up at the cemetery, and you're like, where's the headstone? And they're like, well, it's over there.
And you're left looking like a crazy person.
And they're like, yeah, exactly. It's over there, and that's the right spot. And you're like, well, wait a second. How do I know it's the right spot?
Right.
Right? Because I've been coming here. You never. Well, we looked at our maps and we figured it out. And we actually when we did it last time, our map was upside down. And so spot 2 from this side is different than spot 2 from that side.
Are you talking about the one with whiteout or without whiteout?
Yeah, exactly. And so now we're go look over there, and that's where it should be. And you're like, all right, well, okay, now how do I know where it should
Right.
be? You didn't even know where it should be.
Well, let me ask you that to that extent, right? Like, let's say, whatever, the records show that that's correct, that they've moved it to the correct spot, but they did make a mistake. The negligence has already occurred, right? So there's opportunity for damages there, or has funeral home, this is maybe more for the funeral home or cemetery to hear, but like, have they done what they were supposed to do? Or even in the example where you said, they moved it, they put it in the right spot now, but they don't tell you, right? Let's say they do tell you. They call you get a phone call that a very, pun intended, grave phone call one day, and they're like, "Hey, by the way, just so you know, it's in the right plot now." Our bad. Is that the resolution, or has negligence already occurred? Clearly, damage has already occurred, and something to be done about that. Does it limit damages? Does it start to reduce because they did something in good faith? I don't know. I'm sure your answer is going to be, it depends, but tell me a little bit more about that.
Let me take you to Law School 101.
Okay, let's
go Law School 101.
I don't even have to take an LSAT. This is great.
I talk to people about this all the time. Like, what are your damages, right? And there's this concept in law school called the Egg Shell Plaintiff Rule, right? You ever hear this concept?
I have not.
Okay, so here's what the Egg Shell Plaintiff Rule means. You know what the plaintiff is, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if you punch somebody in the face, right, and you had no idea, but they have extremely frail bones, and you punching them in the face completely destroys their face, right? It's not what you expected to happen, right? But this person has some sort of disease where their bones are super frail. So, the Glass movie or whatever,
Sure.
right? So punching them in the face completely destroys their head.
Okay.
Right? You, as the person that did something wrong, are stuck with that plaintiff, right? That's
Right.
the eggshell plaintiff. That's the person that you chose to punch in the face.
Right.
Right. Maybe you should have thought about maybe maybe their bones are made of glass before you punch them in the face.
Sure.
Right. And so I think something like that kind of concept really applies to the cemetery context, because there's some people that are not very religious. There's some people that are like, did you see that Mike Tyson video that was just on where he's interviewed by the little girl? And
I keep getting quotes for her. It keeps getting pushed in my head.
Actually, there's a perfect time to talk about it because
Okay.
we're talking about the cemeteries. And so she's like, well, what do you want your legacy to be? And he's like, what legacy? You're dead. He's telling a 10-year-old girl, like, what legacy? You're dead. I don't care about legacy, right? And she's like looking at him. She's like, oh, okay, thanks for that answer.
Back to you,
right?
Mike.
Yeah, right? But like, that's actually a great point. Some people don't think about it like that at all. Right. And to some people, there is no damages, period. Right. There's some people that had their sick mother living in their house for the last 5 years before she passed. And they've taken care of every need of hers, hand and foot, for the last 5 years. And now they can't have closure because something happened.
Yep.
Right. And so that plaintiff is a completely different plaintiff than Mike Tyson.
Right.
Right. And so it's a case by case basis. It depends on how you feel. A lot of things about emotional distress. And again, we're just learning about this now. People are talking about it a lot more. 50 years ago, I wasn't alive, but what we hear about 50 years ago is like, hey, stop being so soft, right?
Right.
Yeah,
right.
you'll deal with it. Stop complaining. Don't cry about it, right? Now it's like, oh, we want to
Mental health and emotional toll, and we have
you don't
words
want
for this now.
right? And you don't want to bottle these feelings up because that's even worse, and it causes stress, and it makes you older, and it makes you die faster, right?
Yep.
And so, what I'm trying to say is, for different people, it's different, number one. Number two, for emotional distress, that actually causes other physical harms, right? So if you're getting nightmares because you don't know if the right person is in the casket or in the ground where they say he is, that's preventing you from sleeping. You not sleeping well is adding stress to your body. It's taking years off your life. It's preventing your work performance, whatever it may be,
Being
right?
there for your family that's still living.
You're
and all
not
this-
eating,
right,
or maybe
right.
you're stress eating, or maybe this depression's, you can't get out of bed, you can't go to work because you're thinking about how, oh my God, all I was supposed to do is, make sure that my mom, this is the one thing that my mom or dad or grandma wanted me to do, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it for them, right? That does a lot more than just emotional distress for people. Sometimes that gives them like real physical, can't eat, can't sleep,
Yep.
type harms. And again, it's different for every person. And so it's so hard to say, well, what are your damages? Because the question that I'm asking people really is, what are your damages? What are you experiencing?
How have you been impacted by this?
Right.
And I think that another term for that, right, is empathy. Another term for that is mental health, and tying those together. That I think it's great that you come to it from that perspective, right? And that and that I think folks shouldn't be ashamed if they feel that there's been negligence, if there's question marks around the end of life of one of their loved ones. And they're wondering what happened. It sounds to me, and this is non-lawyer speak here, but it sounds to me like the funeral homes, the cemeteries, the directors, they have a responsibility not just in executing on what they promised, but in delivering the information and setting the expectations in a way that keeps the surviving loved ones in the know and comfortable. And if you're a person who isn't in the know, if you feel like there are things that are question marks, that is more likely, at the very least, that the funeral home, the director, the cemetery that you went with isn't doing their job properly. That is enough of an indication that you may need to speak to an attorney.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a great case with good language in it that I should have brought, and I'm sorry I forgot it, but I'll try to summarize it. So, when you leave your child at a daycare,
Yep.
right, you expect that the daycare's got it. Right. Or you leave your child at school, you expect the school's got it. They're now supervising your child.
Yep.
Right. And you're not there to interfere or intervene or anything like that. From the moment you drop them off to the moment you pick them up, it's their responsibility.
Yep.
Right. And there's a similar kind of line of thinking for a funeral home and a cemetery. Right. You're in charge, funeral home, cemetery, of taking care of my loved one. Right. I'm not an expert funeral person. Right. I'm not an expert grave digger, cemetery map, evaluator.
Sure.
Right. I'm not. I am deferring to you. You're the expert, right? You go to an accountant or you go to a lawyer. I can't do taxes, right?
Right.
You go to an accountant, you expect that the accountant knows what they're doing, right? And it's a similar kind of thing, is you're entrusting some additional person with the care of the remains of your loved one. Right. And they have a heightened duty to make sure that they do a good job.
And
just like
right.
you can't, lie to the IRS as an accountant.
Right.
Right. Or you can't, when you make a mistake as an accountant, people can sue you because you made a mistake as an accountant and you're the expert. Here, the funeral director, the cemetery people, they're the experts. So they have a heightened responsibility because we are entrusting them with this. We don't know any better. If they
Right.
tell us your loved one was autopsied, you shouldn't go see them. We don't, because we don't know any better.
So I think that's a good place to kind of get to, solutions here, right? And the solution, if you're suspicious that something might have happened, the very fact that you're suspicious most likely is because you're not being communicated to properly by the funeral home, cemetery, funeral home director. And that generally is an indication something might be awry, because they should have these systems and processes in place because they're responsible for the last right and care of your loved one. Talk a little bit about your process at Kaminsky Law. So I suspect that something happened. I'm not happy about it. I don't know what to do. I call you guys. Give me a high-level understanding of what I can expect, what the process will be, in sort of getting my case forward.
Okay, so when you call us, one of the things we'll typically ask you, we'll obviously ask you what happened, why you think that there's an issue, what the concern are. The things that we always tell people to keep track of is whatever communications you have, I tell people, to the best you can, try to put things in writing, right?
Yep.
Because somebody's going to say, well, I didn't tell you that, right? Or I didn't say that.
Sure.
So if you send a text message, you send an email, it's a lot better because they're going to respond to it. If you're emailing somebody and they're picking up the phone and calling you, that's a red flag right there.
Yep.
Right. But number one, we'll ask you for whatever documents you have. Right. Number two, if it's something that's wrong with the graves or in the cemetery, I tell people, take pictures. Right. It's okay to take pictures. Take pictures of how it was, I don't tell people to just go out to the grave and just do a photo shoot.
Right.
But generally speaking, if there's something wrong, take a picture of it. Also, I can't stress this enough because we get a lot of pictures. People will zoom in just right on the grave, right? And they'll take a picture and say there's something wrong with it. Make sure you get the surrounding areas when you take pictures, because you want to be able to triangulate where is it or where is it supposed to be, and it's very hard to do if you're super zoomed in. So keep that in mind, or at least take multiple pictures. Whatever contracts you guys signed, there's what did you pay for? What were they supposed to do, right? That's usually in writing. Information, if you can get any information from the cemetery informally, they should be giving you this stuff. If you go and ask them for a map, if you go and ask them for, hey, can I see all the records that you guys have for this grave? They shouldn't be saying no. It's there, let me see what you guys are relying on, right? So we'll ask you for that. So try to have that ready, or try to, have that organized. Tell us the story. Tell us, we're here. We listen to the stories. We have great paralegals. What they do is they take down all this information. They relay it to the lawyers. The lawyers will look at it. If it's something we can help with, we reach out. We try to help you. Even if it's not a case that we can take on, we really do strive to give people some closure.
Sure.
And if it's easy closure to give, it feels good for us to do that for you.
That's great.
And if there is a case to pursue, we'll actively pursue it. We're licensed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but we have good relationships with lawyers in New York. We're developing other relationships with lawyers in other states, which kind of just happened because we get these calls and it's like, hey, this happened in Colorado. So now I'm looking for somebody that sounds like they know what they're talking about to me, to try to direct you to somebody in Colorado or wherever it may be. So yeah, and different states have different laws. And so unfortunately we can't help everybody. We've gotten calls from like Michigan's and Maryland's, and unfortunately we're just not licensed there. We do our best. Don't hold it against us, but we will try to,
well, it's an indication you have the expertise, right? The people are reaching out to you. It's a space that you have, a history of understanding the area, the case law, and how to help people. And it's great to hear that people from around the country are reaching out and asking for that support. We've talked a lot about explaining the issue. We've talked a lot about, where there may be negligence and how to find it. We've also talked about the things that Kaminsky Law can do to help. I want to end this session on, if at all, the opportunity for being proactive, right? So, if I, let's say, am in that situation where I have a loved one that's already buried, there's a plot held for another loved one to be buried next to them. Maybe it's, a husband-wife situation, my parents, let's say. And I'm worried that the spot might not be being held, or I just want to make sure that the cemetery has done their due diligence and has really held that plot. What can I do now other than just driving over there and checking? What can I do now? What are things that I can do to be proactive? We talked about insurance, right? Making sure that the director is insured and the funeral home is insured. What else can I do to be proactive? Unfortunately, in this space, there's really not a ton you can do, right? It's very hard to tell from the surface what's going on underground, right? And so I've had situations where people are like, hey, we own two graves next to each other, like you just said. And, mom was buried 10 years ago. And from the headstones around here, it doesn't look like they could bury another body, right? And you go to the cemetery. And if these people are also willing to help and also want to make sure to give people, to avoid people freaking out or calling lawyers or just being stressed about the situation, they'll go out there and they'll walk through it with you. Hey, our graves are 36 inches by 9 feet. And so that's all the space we need to bury somebody. And so look here, I know it doesn't really look like it because the headstones are kind of, creeping in, but here's a solid 36 inches by 9 feet where we'll be able to dig and it's not going to be an issue. Right. And so a lot of times, a good customer or customer service friendly cemetery is going to do that with you. Right. Unfortunately, a lot of the places we see are, big business and the people there are trained on sell. They're not trained on, hey, okay, now that we've sold, let me go customer service. Right. And, these places will have, they'll have rules and regulations that they're supposed to follow. And sometimes, unfortunately, people call us because they haven't read the rules and regulations themselves. They're like, hey, I put a fence around the grave and they took it down. Wow. It's like, oh, well, the rules and regulations say you can't put a fence around the grave. Right. And so it's like, also just read the rules of the cemetery that you're about to buy, spend 5, 7, 10 grand to buy graves in. Right. Or ask them these questions before you buy the graves. Right. Who else can, how many spaces are here? Or what do you guys do to make sure that there's no mistakes? Or show me what your records are like. And, to ask these questions yourself. Some people are, again, they're shy. They're embarrassed to do it. They don't want to do it. But it's better to, spend 5 minutes being uncomfortable than, a long time toiling over whether or not this is correct. That's great advice, and it's really helpful, and it's great to know that there's an experienced law firm that are processing these cases and helping people get closure in whatever way that they can. Anton, thank you so much. If you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe. I think if you know anyone that's died, or we're all going to go to the same place at some point, it's important to understand these things, your rights and the rules. So thank you, Anton. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, and great questions, man.